between Egypt and Babylon between 609 and 587 BC. We can see Judah is really trying to figure out what is going on. In the Biblical Archaeology Today for 1985, the Israel Exploration Society, Donald B. Redford has an article, The Relations Between Egypt and Israel from El Amarna to the Babylonian Conquest. And then he's showing the imperialism of the Egyptians in relation to Israel, and he has at least 35 studies. It'd take me the rest of this video series to read all these studies to you, just the titles, but it is a prolific subject now. So it's something we have to update ourselves on if we're going to be serious about understanding. The interesting thing is, in the very first chapter, in the first and second verses of the Book of Mormon, it comes out with the correct political, religious, and cultural and linguistic influences about Egyptian influence and their own use of the Hebrew Judaic background to which the Jews properly belonged. But they were under Egyptian control, and it influenced everything across the board, and I'll share more of that with you just shortly. Now on page 266, Egyptian writing in Israel, Thompson says, some of the specific cultural artifacts that have recently been uncovered in and around the land of Judah provide good evidence that Lehi would indeed have had opportunities to learn Egyptian near his home in Jerusalem. Archaeologists in Canaan are unearthing a growing body of artifacts that feature Egyptian writing on them. The nature of these artifacts, as postulated by the scholars, suggest an adoption by Syro-Palestinian locals of Egyptian script for accounting purposes. Still other artifacts suggest the presence of Egyptian scribes in the area. Due to its prominent, Orly Goldwasser states that Egyptian writing was the more progressive form of Egyptian cultural influence attested in Israel in the 8th and 7th centuries. The kind of Egyptian script being employed on those artifacts dating around the time of Lehi is hieratic. But since Demotic was the script of the day in northern Egypt, and abnormal hieratic was predominant in southern Egypt, the normal hieratic tradition in Canaan must have been adopted from an earlier time. That is, the Palestinians, the Jews, are learning the Egyptian writing and language now. This was continued in Israel from the 10th century. So we're talking centuries of influence here, off and on. On page 267 he says, this use of hieratic script in Canaan has led Goldwasser to propose further that during the height of the New Kingdom's cultural influence in Canaan, many scribes and teachers made their way into the Levant to set up businesses. We would like to suggest that these Egyptian-trained scribes, cut off from their own homeland, they were well acquainted with Egyptian decorum as well as the Canaanite language. They educated local scribes who in their turn passed on their knowledge to their successors. Such a view, bolstered by the Egyptian title scribe, appearing in hieratic on an artifact from Lachish, suggests the possibility that by Lehi's day, scribes having a knowledge of Egyptian had existed in the area for quite some time, and they had maintained a tradition of writing Egyptian. The fact that an Egyptian scribal tradition existed locally could imply that Lehi learned Egyptian from a local scribe, or even from his own father, just as Lehi presumably taught Nephi, and Nephi says that in 1 Nephi 1, 1 and 2. It's very remarkably interesting how the evidence attests to a solidly established relationship between Egypt and Israel. Egyptian political and cultural influence in Israel surrounded the time of Lehi. It was at its peak. Egyptian language was being employed for record-keeping purposes, and the possibility of an Egyptian scribal tradition existed in the area of Jerusalem. This gives plausibility to the Book of Mormon's claim that Lehi and his posterity learned and used Egyptian for record-keeping purposes. That is specifically why they mentioned it. The authenticity of the Book of Mormon continues to be sustained as the picture of Lehi's Jerusalem becomes clearer through the archaeological, historical, and linguistic evidences. This is powerful. The Book of Mormon opens up with an absolute solid ring of authenticity in the first chapter, in the first 2 verses in that Book of Mormon. But there's other scholarly studies that I want to share with you besides Thompson's. I also have John Gee's chapter 10, Egyptian Society during the 26th dynasty, that is very significant. John Gee notes in chapter 10, this is page 277 of Glimpses in Lehi's Jerusalem. John Gee, the LDS Egyptologist, he says, Egypt in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC is often considered the last high point of pharaonic civilization. And he discusses the history of the Saitic period, Necho II, Semiticus' reigns, their invasions. He describes the society. It was based on the family, of course, as we understand, and he discusses the literacy. Now, on page 281, he notes this about the literacy. Education was a family affair. Knowledge of reading and writing was passed down from father to son. Well, this is exactly as the Book of Mormon depicts it, definitely. Education in writing was done by copying models, often of didactic content. And you note that Nephi did that with Lehi's record also. So the Book of Mormon in its opening phases is spot on perfect about what we understand about the historical record, thanks to the archaeology and the historical contexts of the discoveries. Egypt also exported some scribes, since they are attested as far away as Nimrod in the Assyrian Empire. He says on page 282, as literate members of the society, priests served as public notaries and experts on law as well. The legal codes were kept in temple archives. Priests served as judges, and judgment took place at the gate of the temple. Priests who were in the courtyard of the temple served as witnesses to documents, often including their priestly titles in their signatures. Note what he says about scripts here. This is very interesting. A variety of scripts were employed in Egypt at Lehi's time. Hieroglyphics were still employed in stone. Hieratic was still used on papyrus, but it was also used on stone, which is both harder to carve and harder to read. A cursive form of hieratic, called either late Theban cursive or abnormal hieratic, was used in the southern part of the country, but was being phased out at this time, being replaced through the reforms of Semiticus. And it was being replaced by what they called Demotic. This is a different variety of cursive hieratic that developed in the north at a time when the 2 ends of the country had been politically separate. Since the Saites who reunited Egypt came from the north of the country, the business script of their area became the standard for the country. Additionally, some religious manuscripts used a script called linear hieroglyphics. That was midway between hieroglyphs and hieratic. There is at least one example of a historical text of this time period consisting of a Semitic language being written in a Demotic script, as well as quotations from one of the Psalms of the Hebrew Bible. That is, they were using Hebrew to write the Egyptian language, but they were using Hebrew characters. I've got a lot of studies on that I'll share with you. John Gee notes that here on page 282. He goes through the religion, Egypt and Judah. Now, Aaron P. Shade, who is a PhD candidate in Northwest Semitic languages, right now up in Toronto, in his chapter 11, The Kingdom of Judah, Politics, Prophets, and Scribes in the Late Pre-Exilic Period, he says the purpose of this chapter is to define the general condition of the Kingdom of Judah on the eve of her destruction in 586 BC. So this is the current scholarly understanding of it. It's in the context of the social, political climate of the day and in relation to foreign interactions between Judah and her neighbors. An examination of both internal and external affairs will more clearly portray the final days of the kingdoms of Judah, and it gives us a political as well as historical and cultural context to what is going on in the opening of the Book of Mormon.